Here we are again. Once again, it's not Steve. So, for those that have been around for even maybe 4 weeks, you'll recognise that the pastor, Steve, seems to have given up preaching for Lent. But but the joy of that is that you've been able to follow through with James and continue our series with James, and we've had myself and Paul and Ade share with you. And we're going to continue that series today. And actually, we're going to finish that series today. But we've been walking through James over the period of Lent. You know, Lent is a time for the church when we consider just slowing down. Maybe you've given something up, like preaching. But what we do is we just take this time to simplify and to pay attention to our faith, and we allow God to surface in us what might be going on. And the book of James has been an ideal companion for that, if not a little bit difficult. But James is like a pastor calling for believers to a faith that's not just believed, but it's lived. A world full of words. James challenges us to do the word, to let our faith be visible in how we speak, serve, endure, and pray. And as Paul reminded us last week, we remember who James is. He's the brother of Jesus. And how impressive that sounds until we recognise that James didn't actually always believe in Jesus and who he was. And as Paul said, to be fair, if we had a brother who claimed to be the Messiah, we probably wouldn't believe that either. But James moves from skepticism into surrender. And he never cashes in on that relationship. In fact, he starts by writing James, instead of James, brother of Jesus, he writes James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Not status, not proximity, but servanthood. And that's the kind of faith that we've been exploring through James. And James doesn't let that faith be abstract and out there like unobtainable. He keeps asking us the same uncomfortable and important questions. What does faith look like in real life? What does it look like for you? Not just what you say you believe, but how you believe. Not the theology we agree with, but what happens in our life when that faith touches us. When life squeezes us, when relationships become complicated, when our words slip out faster than we mean them to. In week 1, we saw that faith is revealed in those trials. The pressure exposes what's going on inside of us. Week 2, we saw that faith reshapes the way we treat people. Mercy becomes more visible than status. In week 3, we looked at the power of words. And James reminded us that the tongue is very small, but it's very powerful in the words we speak. But that actually what it does reveal is the state of our heart. And last week, we looked at how James moves the conversation somewhere even more uncomfortable. And that was with conflict. And Paul explored with us, not Paul in the Bible, that conflict was a symptom to a much bigger problem, that our desires have perhaps moved off centre. And our pride has perhaps become rooted in our own selfish desires. And that we struggle to humbly submit to the Lord. And this series is really about inviting us to move beyond surface religion and embrace that practical, courageous faith. One that reflects the heart of Christ in everyday life, one that we're all called to live. And I just want to say, we can stand here and talk, but I want to say it's not easy. It really is not easy. As simple as it may sound, the words that come out of our mouths, it's not easy. And so today we're concluding that series ahead of our Easter services coming up. And we're kind of going to be going through the rest of James. So we've got James 4:13 onwards, right to the end of James 5. And that sounds a lot. But I'm going to break it down paragraph by paragraph as we go, rather than all at once. And I'm going to be looking at what I think is 4 invitations that James makes to us as believers. as we walk this. So we're going to start at the end of James 4, and I'm going to be reading verse 13 to 17. The words will appear on the screen if you haven't got your Bible. Bible's always good to bring. So, boasting about tomorrow. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why do you not even why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is in the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them. And I think the first invitation that James makes to us here continues on from what Paul shared, and that is to consider a posture of humility. Consider a posture of humility. And maybe like you, I don't know how you organise your year. You know, for us, maybe come December, we've got a big 12-month planner in front of us on the table, and we begin to fill in our plans for the year. So we might start with, are there any family events that we know are going to happen this year, like weddings and things like that? When do we want to go on holiday? And we plan them in. And then we sort of think, well, what does the church calendar look like? You know, the church calendar is very seasonal. We know we know when Christmas, Easter, and those things are going to be. So we might map some of those things in. And we begin to pad it out with what needs to happen through the year. So maybe you might do that. Maybe you're more of a, I'm going to think what's happening next week kind of person. And I'll put a few things in the diary. Maybe you don't know when you're ever going on holiday, and I don't know how you live like that, because surely you want to know when you're going on holiday. No, but and then we might sort of go through the year as it goes, and we add things to it, and we might then start thinking about 2028. That's probably too much for some of you, but just you might even be the sort of person, you've got the next 10 years kind of mapped out. You want to know your career goals, your financial goals, your retirement strategy. These are all valid systems and conversation and plans that we have to put in place, right? Because, these things don't just happen. We can't just wake up one day and have a retirement fund. You have to plan ahead. It's not strange. It's normal. Planning is part of being responsible. For those of you that are still catching up with that kind of adult chore, that's fine. It's good and it's right to be responsible. And one day you can do that. But James interrupts that conversation, I feel. And he interrupts it and he says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Perfectly reasonable. If you've ever run a business, I'm sure that is something that you would regularly do. But James says, why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. And he kind of gives this striking description then of human life. And he says, what is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And James wants to stop us, I think, in our tracks there for a minute, to think about something that we often forget. That, in fact, our lives are fragile. The future is something we can plan for and should be responsible for, but it's not something we're actually in control of. And the invitation in that humility is to propel us to change how we live today. When we make those plans, if life is but a mist, if it is short, how are we going to live humbly before God? And he talks about that, I guess, confident business person or people. They're making their plans. They know where they're going. They know how to do it. They know where they're going to live and what profit they're going to make. And the problem isn't their planning. The problem is their presumption in the planning. They talk about the future as if they already own it. And James reminds them, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. And that's not just in the church. We can live like that. It's quite worldly as well. I don't know, like modern day people would call it manifesting. It's very interesting. People in the world, they go, we're going to manifest that. And we're going to think and we're going to desire and we're going to walk in a direction. We're going to focus everything until we get it. And that's how they live. They live with that same presumption. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy as far as I can tell. But we're not too far away from that in the church, because we have all these plans and desires, not knowing what tomorrow will bring and that we are just a mist. We live human life like that, not meaningless. It's not meaningless, but it is temporary. And we live as if we have endless time. And James reminds us that it's brief and fragile. And so actually, whilst we're making these plans and whilst we're assuming our future, we need to think about God in the midst of that. He says, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. And I don't mean like that, just some religious slogan at the end of a sentence. I do know people like that. They're like, oh, next week I'm going off to take my pet to visit my friend, God willing. I'm like, well, what do you mean, God willing? Just make the plan, But it's not about this religious slogan. It's actually an invitation to think about the posture of our heart and to think about how we humbly come before God, that we recognize that God is Lord of tomorrow. God is Lord of our lives. And we can make plans, but we hold plans lightly because our lives ultimately rest in God's hands. And we want to be obedient and we want to trust the Lord with the direction and the leading of our lives. We want to be people that do as the Lord invites. And so we need to speak to that when we're making our plans. When I'm sitting doing my annual calendar, what is the Lord saying? Is there something specific He is asking of me this year? And am I making time for that? Am I saying yes to that? Am I obedient? Am I submitting to that? Because James says, with that surprise warning at the end, anyone who knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it sins. And so we want to be in a position where we're submitting and following through. And that's the invitation, because the brevity of life, it could send us into fear and panic, couldn't it? It could be like we could live the opposite and go, I'm just going to live and be free and do whatever I want because life is short. But actually saying the brevity of life should move us to action. It should move us to action, that we shouldn't delay in doing good, that we shouldn't delay in responding to the invitation of the Lord, to put off things that the Lord is asking us to do, to move away from assuming that there will always be another opportunity because it's a mist. And then we change tack as we enter into James 5, verses 1-6. Warning to the rich oppressors. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgent. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. And I think the second invitation that James is making there is that we would use our resource with wisdom. At the beginning of chapter 5, James, as I said, it feels like it changes quite dramatically. And, he's speaking quite abruptly and directly. And he's actually speaking to the wealthy landowners who were actually abusing their power. He says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you." That's strong language. And James wasn't condemning wealth in any way. He was actually condemning the wealth that they'd gained and used unjustly. He describes riches that are rotting and clothes eaten by moths. I think my wardrobe might look like that when I come to sort out the summer clothes, because I keep just chucking things in it. Tells me something. But the clothes are eaten by moths and the gold is corroding. Why? Because they were just storing it up. They were storing the wealth and they were ignoring the needs of those around them. And James was exposing a specific injustice when he was speaking, because he said, "The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you." And in the first century, many labourers were paid day by day. Literally, they had to work that day in order to earn. And if a landowner withheld those wages on any given day, and it could have been prolonged day by day, these workers might not have had enough resource to feed their families, to care for their families. It was an injustice. And those unpaid wages were responding, they were crying out. And God hears that cry. And he uses the word, the Lord of hosts. And actually that refers to the Lord of heaven's armies. So it wasn't just a small play, it was like the Lord of heaven's armies. God who hears the cries of the oppressed isn't a powerless God. He sees injustice and he will judge it. And James warns the wealthy that live a life of luxury built on injustice is spiritually dangerous. If they are living self-indulgent, if we live self-indulgent while others suffer, it could lead to judgment. And the message is simple but challenging, isn't it? Money is not the problem. Whatever resource we have is not the problem. It's about where our heart lays. It's about money without justice becoming corruption. The question is how we use what we have. How do we use the resource that God has given us? Do we use it only for ourselves? And it's right to think about the needs of living and your family and that sort of provision. But do we also consider how do we use our resources in ways that reflect God's justice and generosity? And how do we enter into that invitation, also knowing that we want to plan well, but life is a mist. So can we trust our Lord to be our provider? Can we just trust the Lord that his justice will reign in that? James 5:7, patience in suffering. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. So I think the third invitation that James makes is for us to wait faithfully, because the Lord is coming. After such stern warning to the rich, James turns to the believers who are suffering. And I think his tone also changes, doesn't he? He says, be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. And he's not talking about patience that's just a passive resignation. Okay, Sarah, Sarah. He's not saying that. He's talking about faithful endurance. And he gives the example of a farmer who plants seeds in the ground and then waits for the rain. He cannot force the harvest to come early. And I think if we look at that as an example, I know myself, I fall prey to the seed's been planted today, I'm harvesting tomorrow. Like, what is this waiting about? I just like to see, do your thing. You've had 24 hours, what's going on? When a farmer does that, he has to wait, and he relies on some of his effort and the effort of the seasons and the planting. And it's waiting, and it's taking care and tending in the process. You can't force the harvest to come at any other time than harvest time. And we need to think about the patience in that. But a good farmer also knows that he might have a crop failure because some things are out of his control. There may be crop failures. And if the farmer just decided because of the crop failure that he wasn't going to seed again, we'd all be pretty stuck, to be honest, if the farmers weren't doing their job. But we need to think about how we look at that. Do we give up sowing because we once had a crop failure? Or do we go again and wait and hope? Because we know harvest will come, because that is what the word says. And James says believers should live like that farmer, waiting with steady faith, because something is coming. The coming of the Lord is near. And James uses the word in the Greek, parousia, and that literally means the arrival of a king, like on a state visit. It comes from the word paron, to be present, to arrive into a situation. But actually here it was properly known as coming, especially the arrival of the owner who alone can deal with a situation. So it's a very specific using of that word. The one person that can deal with the situation correctly is coming. Jesus will return. And when he does, justice will finally be done. So James encourages those believers not to lose heart. Encourages us so that we don't stop and step in to deal with it ourselves. Who's good at that? I try to deal with situations myself so I can manufacture my preferred outcome, because isn't that what we want? We want our preferred outcome. And what we end up with is like a bodge job. Like, oh, it's fine, I'm just a plumbing. I'll do it. I'll give it a go. Put a bit of tape on. Perfectly fine. But it is a bodge job. It's a bodge job. And you know that bodge job is going to come undone. And so instead of waiting for the proper person who can come and deal with the situation correctly, we often move in, don't we, and try and resolve that ourselves. But James reminds us that the prophets who endure the suffering in the waiting, they remain faithful in their hardship. He reminds us of Job. For those that haven't read the book of Job, this is why it's good to read the whole Bible, because you kind of get to know what they're talking about in the New Testament when they're referring to the Old Testament. The book of Job is a wisdom book, and it explores the story of why good people suffer. It's a really good book to read, even if it's hard. And it follows this wealthy, faithful man named Job, and he loses everything. He loses his family, he loses his wealth, he loses his health, he suffers in that. And it becomes this wager between God and Satan over who has Job's faith. It's testing whether Job's faith was conditional. But Job remains faithful despite his immense suffering. And it's suffering. And he has these big debates with his friends. But ultimately, it leads to this confrontation with God. But subsequently, it leads to Job's full restoration. He waited faithfully. And that's the invitation. It's very significant what James was saying. The Lord is coming. He is coming. He sees you waiting, and he is working. And then James points us to the church towards one of the most powerful tools that God has given us. The tool of tools, I call it. We sing about things, don't we, and worship being the tool, but the tool of tools is prayer. It's prayer. And he says this, the prayer of faith. Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth, and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. So that's the fourth invitation he makes, is that we would pray. And he says if someone's in trouble or suffering, pray. If someone's happy or joyful, then sing praise. If someone is sick, call the elders and pray. The Christian community and what is at the heart of our community is a place where people can encourage and point one another towards God and before God. And James gives us this remarkable promise: the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. It's not a weak or passive activity that we sometimes do. It is participation in the work of the Lord. And James shows us perseverance in that. Persevere in prayer. Pray in every situation. And he begins with those situations, doesn't he? He said, if you're suffering, let them pray. If you're cheerful, let them sing praise. The point is that prayer isn't just for emergencies. Sometimes we go about life, don't we? And then there's an emergency and we're like, oh, hold on a minute, let me pray about that. Prayer isn't just for emergencies. It's a continuous walk through the seasons of life: suffering, joy, sickness, struggle. And that means ongoing, not occasional. It should be our first port of call, not our last port of call. And as a believer, we're encouraged to keep praying, to not stop praying if the life changes or is challenging. Remain constant in prayer. This open dialogue between you and the Father. Prayer involves the whole church. He says, if anyone among you is sick, let them call the elders of the church to pray over them. Our perseverance in prayer doesn't have to be done alone. A sick person calls for help. Someone in need calls for help. The elders pray. The community participates. Persistent prayer becomes a shared responsibility amongst us for God to move. How often do we struggle in silence? How often do we not ask? How often do we just keep that thing to ourselves? But the church praying together is a powerful tool. We have city groups. We meet every week in small groups together around the city. And those things aren't just nice places to be and go. I mean, they are. And if you're not in a city group, what are you doing in the week? How are you getting your prayer? Who's supporting you? Who is in your life that you can share things with, and then they're praying for you constantly? I really encourage that. It's an amazing gift you're missing out on if you're not part of a city group, because the church working together, the community participating in the prayer for you and for your life, it's an amazing thing. The Lord acts, and I'm sure you could speak to some of the city group leaders and they will tell you some of the prayers that have been answered with groups praying for things. Side note, but be in prayer with other people. Because prayer is powerful. Prayer that includes confession and restoration is the next. James continues, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. It's not just about asking for things. It's bringing your things to the point of confession, to reconciliation, to healing. We want to continually be bringing our lives honestly before God. And we can do that, can't we? We can do it alone because maybe we feel shame or we're afraid. But there's something that is special when we can do it before God with one another, where you can be encouraged, where you can see God revealed in the words of others in a good way. God is always revealing things to restore us. And we get to do that in the joy of confession and reconciliation with one another. And we want to have prayer that believes God is working. James says the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And the Greek word he implies here is the word for effective is energeo. I think it's geo. I couldn't remember how to say it, but it implies power in motion. So it's similar to our word energy. Heartfelt prayer from a person standing right before God actively creates change. Persevering prayer continues because believers trust that God is acting even when the answer isn't immediate, even when it seems like the answer's not coming. And I also have to say my experience is that God is even acting even when the answer isn't what I want it to be. He is still true. And our faith should sustain this persistence in prayer. And he talks about the example of Elijah. Again, you need to have been in the Old Testament to know who Elijah is. But Elijah, was a human being, just like you and I. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain. I often pray that prayer. I've not seen it answered yet, but James refers to this story recorded in the first book of Kings. And Elijah prayed, and the drought lasted 3.5 years. 3.5 years they had no rain. And he later then again prayed for rain, and the rain came. But the key point is that Elijah was a human. He was just like us. Persevering prayer isn't just for spiritual giants. We may see people and we think they're amazing and all their prayers are answered and they do this and that, but it's not just for those people. It's for everyone. And that's what James is presenting before us, that we would pray in every circumstance, that we would pray with our community, that we would connect our prayer with confession and healing, that we would trust God's power, and that we would think about Elijah's persistence. And I just want to say, prayer is not a quick request. Sometimes it is. Sometimes we have those quick moments where we ask someone to fire off a prayer and it is answered. But it's mostly a faithful, ongoing relationship with the Lord, a dialogue. And I think James has been quite a powerful reminder for us as a church through this series that we have gone through. Maybe you've missed them. I would recommend going online and finding the podcast to listen to it. And maybe you might need to listen to it like me several times, because this is an ongoing reminder, but a powerful reminder. Because he's saying here, life is a mist. It appears for a while and it vanishes. And that truth should change how we live. It calls us to humility. Tomorrow is not ours to control. Our lives are held by God in his hand. And we want to use that time, that second invitation, with wisdom, with all the things that God has given us. How do we use those things with wisdom? How we treat others matters deeply to God. with our resources, with our words. We cannot separate faith from what we have and the way we use the things that we have. We are called to be faithful and to have faithful patience, even when the world feels unfair, even when it feels unjust, when it's hard, when it feels broken. God has not forgotten. The Lord is coming. Don't change course. Don't try and fix it yourself. And fourthly, pray. Enter into prayer. Open up that continued dialogue with the Lord, because we want to see the outworking of this fragile but fruitful life that we live. And it's hard. It's a really hard challenge. It's like James makes it easy for us to understand how to live, but the reality of trying to live that is difficult. And everyone will have their stuff. No one is without their stuff. No one. It's not easier for anyone else than it is for the next person. But together, James calls us individually, but together to live a life of faithfulness, walking that journey with the Lord.